Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. The resurgence of McLaren is putting quite possibly insurmountable pressure on Sergio Perez at Red Bull, with both Christian Horner and Helmut Marko criticising the Mexican driver more severely this past weekend than they have done all season long after another disastrous performance. It seems Red Bull may have realised if they want to win the Constructors' Championship again next season, they may well need to replace Perez, and they might need to do it sooner rather than later. Very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always, I greatly appreciate it. The big drama of yesterday was the reaction of the drivers to the incredibly physically challenging conditions of the Qatar Grand Prix this past weekend. Now, this is the thing with saying, oh, well, the drivers, they can decide if they want to retire or not. You get these quotes from Ocon that he says, well, you know, you'd need to kill me before I retire, like I ain't doing it. So there does come to a point where the drivers, if they're on the verge of passing out in the high-speed corners and can potentially cause serious collisions as a result if they were to black out with either for themselves or with other drivers, there comes a point where questions are raised. And I wondered whether there would be a response over this, but actually the FIA did come out yesterday and say that they'll be working with Formula 1 to avoid a repeat of the extreme conditions experienced by the drivers during the Qatar Grand Prix. Their statement comes out and says that while being elite athletes, they should not be expected to compete under conditions that could jeopardize their health or safety. The safe operations of cars is at all times the responsibility of competitors, but as with other matters relating to such things as infrastructure or safety requirements, the FIA will take measures to establish appropriate parameters. Now, next season, I believe the Qatar Grand Prix is meant to be like right at the start of December, so it's 6 or 7 weeks later. It should be cooler. It's going to be hot, it's Qatar, but it should be cooler, and I imagine if the Pirelli tyres are fixed next season, they don't have to mandate a 3-stop where the drivers are doing quali lap after quali lap for 57 laps in a row because the tyres aren't going to degrade enough over those stints to make any tyre management worthwhile. It's probably going to be okay. But it still has caused a lot of controversy. The reality is people will say, oh, we shouldn't go to Qatar, but we know the reality of the situation here. Now, on this weekend, where Pirelli was deeply under the spotlight because the sidewall of their tyres was simply failing under the conditions of the curbs on these tracks, they were then reconfirmed as the tyre supplier, and they have the contract from 2025 through to 2027 with an option to extend it to 2028. It is believed, though, that Bridgestone, they wanted this contract. They apparently offered more money as well than Pirelli did. But Pirelli, they're the known quantity. Stefano Domenicali wanted to go with that. But Pirelli will almost certainly be done with Formula 1 after this. So at the end of this deal, Bridgestone are the favourites to come through, and Pirelli will be calling it a day, to our understanding, and not extending after that window. I don't think they've done a spectacular job of these tyre compounds. I know that many people would say, well, it's time to give another tyre supplier a go. I would be down for that personally, but that is not going to happen for another few years. Now, Mohammed bin Sulayem over the last few days, he's been cooking a fair little bit actually, because he is giving quotes saying that, first of all, there should be more teams and less races. He says that there should be up to 12 teams and fewer races. We need more teams and fewer races. Okay, I agree, to be honest, and I'm sure many fans do, but it's interesting that the president of the FIA, who, you know, he doesn't get to decide. It's not his ballpark as the governing body to decide what Formula 1, the management group, the ownership thinks about what teams and how many races to do. You know, he's not involved on the commercial side of these operations, but still his pressure is definitely interesting, as previous FIA bosses have not really been so forthright in their opinions on what Formula 1 should do. But, well, friction is there between the parties, as we've known for some time. He also mentions that Austria and Qatar could be removed from the calendar if these issues with track limits remain the case going forwards. Austria, there was something like, was there 1,200 track limits invalidations during that weekend, and Qatar, there was a similar level of issues. There's two alternatives to this. Either you maintain it as it is, the white line is the limit, 4 wheels over the line, that's done, but you take some actual steps to resolve the issues they're having, or you say, all right, we'll go back to what we did 2021 and previously, when certain corners we just agree there's exceptions and the track limit is the curb rather than the white line, which okay, I don't really mind either way, but I just think that the idea they're just doing it on the white line is probably the way to do it. It makes it easier for fans to understand rather than going back and seeing pole laps in previous years and saying, oh, he went off track there, why is it not invalidated? So, you know, ideally, I think what is currently done is good. The problem is that the stewards have a very hard time calling this stuff. It's marginal, it's done by eye as well, rather than any technology that tells them whether somebody is outside of track limits, and therefore it takes time to clear these things up. During the race in Austria, the race had ended. Hours later, they're saying, oh, this guy got an extra penalty, this guy got an extra penalty. They did a better job at managing this during the race in Qatar, but it's not good for the fan experience, especially when qualifying ends. You've got a driver on the mic having come P2, all of a sudden he's to the back of the grid because his lap was discounted. That's not great. So there's a couple of possibilities to resolve this. I guess one would be if there was some automatic system that would actually detect if the car went out, then it would automatically invalidate. That would be good. Like in the F1 game, if you go out, it immediately knows that you've gone out, so it tells you that you have, which would be a good thing, I think. The other alternative is to actually ensure that there's gravel. Street circuits have no issues with track limits because there's a wall there. You can't hit the wall. If you want to go outside track limits, you're smashing into the wall. The same thing can be replicated with changing the runoff areas. This is turn 19 in Qatar. We are going to go there next weekend, and there will be several track limits invalidations in qualifying and in the race at this very corner, because it just pays to carry as much speed as possible, such as turn 1 in Austria, where the drivers literally used to go way off the track and they were fine with it. And even sports car racing, when it's done around Qatar, has at least in the past, the drivers, you can see the rubber that's down here on the outside of this tarmac strip, they don't even bother making this corner. They just drive all over the curbs and all over the runoff area, and that's how it goes. Now, Formula 1, you've got to stay within the lines. How about we put this gravel trap up to here rather than here? Or how about we put grass in all the way around the edge of the curb? Then if you went over track limits, your wheels would be in the grass or in the gravel. That ain't ideal. Then the drivers would learn to avoid it. So I think that's what they're going to have to think about. I'm pretty sure they're going to do that at Austria, and they're going to have to come up with a similar solution, I think, in Qatar, potentially bringing the gravel closer. It might not be ideal for MotoGP, but unfortunately, it might be a necessary evil. Now, over the last 3 races, these are the constructors' points that have been scored by various teams. Red Bull only have 75 in the last 3 races. Guess how many of these are from Sergio Perez? Well, I'll give you a couple of seconds. The answer is 5. 70 for Max, 5 for Red Bull. And honestly, if Hamilton didn't go out in Qatar, Mercedes would have been very close to that figure. Ferrari are very close to that figure, and they had a pretty poor Qatar Grand Prix, to be honest. Alpine are obviously way down, but McLaren 104. They've outscored Red Bull by 29 points over the last 3 races, which is massively impressive, but also goes to show McLaren have 2 drivers. Red Bull have 1 driver, and even Red Bull this season, if they'd entered the championship with 1 car, they would still be leading the Constructors' Championship as it stands. They did win it the other week, and Perez played his part in that. These are his results this season: win in Saudi Arabia, win in Azerbaijan. Both of those, of course, Verstappen qualified out of position due to the failure they had in qualifying in Saudi, and then Azerbaijan, he benefited from the safety car, but still, won those 2 races. But ever since Miami, it's been downhill. Honestly, Miami, starting from P1, Verstappen was way back in the field, losing comfortably, was a dagger. And I honestly think a lot of what we've seen for Perez is lack of confidence. He knows the media speculation is on him, the spotlight is on him all the time. He hasn't felt at one with the car as Max has for some time. His driving style doesn't fit the way this car works. As maybe Piastri and Norris both pretty much like the way that the McLaren handles, the development of the Red Bull has gone away from Perez, as it naturally tends to when you've got a driver that prefers oversteer in Verstappen and a driver that prefers understeer in Perez. That's obviously not going to go in Perez's favour over the course of a season, and the added pressure from Red Bull and the media, in addition to the lack of confidence, is causing him to just not be having a good time. And I think we've seen the same thing with Ricciardo, really. When he went to McLaren, he was getting beat up by Norris week after week, wasn't at one with the car, the confidence was affecting him, his performances were starting to drop, and the only way out of the cycle was to get him out of the team, which they eventually did. And hopefully Ricciardo can have a good comeback, and I'm not saying Perez is a bad driver, but he's not performing well. The last 3 races, 4 points in Singapore in P8, Arguably, he should have got none because he was taking drivers out left, right and centre and probably deserved to get punished more than he did. DNF'd in Japan for taking everybody out. The qualifying's been atrocious in all of these races, by the way. Scored 0 points after crashing in the sprint and recovered to score 1 point after all those track limits penalties in Qatar, despite the fact that Verstappen won both of these last 2 races very comfortably indeed. I'm still pretty mind-blown that Hamilton took himself out, or whatever you want to say, of the race in Qatar, and yet over the weekend still scored more points than Perez and closed on the championship for P2 because, you know, it was obviously a great opportunity for Hamilton, but Perez scored 1 point that weekend. Hamilton scored, 4 something in the sprint race? So yeah, not a pretty sight. Especially when, after this Grand Prix, Horner and Marco, both at Red Bull, have taken the criticism to the next level. Christian Horner even says they straight up do not have an appropriate driver pairing. Mercedes, Ferrari, McLaren, they all have good drivers. Okay, some of them are great, some of them are just good, but whatever you want, whichever driver pairing you think is the best of Mercedes, Ferrari and McLaren, it's better than the driver pairing at Red Bull because it's Max Verstappen that does the scoring and it's Sergio Perez who takes out midfield runners and struggles to get into the points at the moment. And Horner admits this after defending Perez for a long time. He now came out and said, look, he desperately needs to step it up because if he doesn't step it up, he's going to go. And I think there's an incredibly likely chance that he's already gone. Like, someone's made the call there at Red Bull. We know how ruthless they are. That, yes, he is technically having a contract for next season. And on paper, he's down as their driver for 2024. I'm not sure that really they think that's going to be the case. And I wouldn't be surprised if shortly after the Mexican Grand Prix, or give it a little bit of time after the Mexican Grand Prix, when they obviously don't want to say that before then, they might say, you know what, we've made this decision, especially when you've got, Liam Lawson, yeah, well, stay on the sidelines, Liam, but just wait, there might be an opportunity arising at AlphaTauri, as and when Daniel Ricciardo's put back in. There was also lots of talk just last week that they're already planning to replace Perez mid-season with Ricciardo and then put Lawson into the AlphaTauri, or whatever that's going to be called next season, that sister car. So if you're already planning to do it, why not just do it immediately, especially with Perez's performances straight up getting worse and worse? This is what he also went on to say. We have to talk to Perez after the race about why he had such a hard time with track limits. It was a tough race and a tough weekend. He's still seconds. He desperately needs to find his form again. It was actually then spotted yesterday that Perez was on his Insta story at the Red Bull HQ. So maybe that's when they were having their sit down with Perez, with Marco and Horner or whoever, right? Just to discuss, all right, how is this going wrong, Checo, and what do we need to do to turn this around? And I'm not really sure there is any turning it around at this point. The problem really arises as to next year's championship. Yes, Max and the car has dominated this season, but it's in large part due to Max and the dominance of the car. Perez performing as he is at the moment is no problem for this year's constructors. They've already won it. No problem for this year's drivers. They've already won it in Max Verstappen this past weekend. The issue comes when the competitors get better. And it's not just that Mercedes and Ferrari will be expected to do a better job next season. It seems highly doubtful Red Bull will have as successful of a year next year than they've had this year. That seems, you'd think that the other guys should catch up. It should happen. Red Bull will still probably win. That's what people would expect, and Verstappen will probably win, but they can't guarantee it with the way things stand. And it's not just Mercedes and Ferrari, it's also McLaren. McLaren are here. They're the strongest challenger to Red Bull right now. They've outscored Red Bull over the last few races. They've got a great driver pairing that should only improve next season. As their car continues to develop, they simply cannot afford to have Checo in the car anymore if he keeps performing like this. As it stands, with the way McLaren are performing, and potentially with Merc and Ferrari getting back into the mix next season, Max can't do it on his own. And also, Max in P1, let's say the Mercedes boys hadn't taken each other out, there was a good chance, I think, that they actually managed to beat Max that race. He probably had pace in hand, but the pace of the Red Bull this weekend wasn't incredible compared to the McLaren or compared to the Mercedes. Russell even said today he reckons they could have possibly challenged Max for the win there had the situation at the start of the race not happened. And when it is 2 against 1, you've got the strategy options. You've got other things in play. When Checo's back in, well, he started from the pit lane because he crashed the car. Wasn't his fault, but still, you're battling with midfield runners in a sprint race. That shouldn't be where the Red Bull belongs. He obviously went out there to start from the pit lane. He did recover to score 1 point. Should have been more, but, let's not forget, Russell went from basically last behind Perez to P4. And Checo barely got a point in a better car. So it seems to me that Red Bull's hand here might well be getting forced. If McLaren didn't have the comeback they're currently having, I wonder whether they think, you know what, even if Perez is, pretty bad compared to Max, like, we can get away with it, we'll probably still win the Constructors. But now if I'm Red Bull, I'm thinking, I'm not confident we're winning the Constructors next year based on this. If the disparity is this extreme, when the disparity is not as extreme at all at McLaren or especially Mercedes or at Ferrari, then they're going to struggle, even if Max was to win the drivers. But even then, that's more challenging when Perez is not there as a wingman, as he was back in 2021. So this is, as Helmut Marko says, the gap is a problem. It's now a critical problem, even to the extent that we now have to look to McLaren. It is scary that we have to look at the McLaren space in every circuit. They are our most consistent pursuers, and they are still gaining. It could be a tough battle next year, and it's not just McLaren they should worry about. Mercedes are talking about the brand new car they're creating for next year with all these new ideas and everything. Obviously, they're being very optimistic. They tend to be, and they tend to underdeliver over the last couple of years. But the fact that McLaren are there as well is surely making Red Bull think that the Perez situation is not sustainable. And therefore, what should they do? Well, they might only have a few options, and that might be to get him out of the car. As I say, Checo is 9 points behind Max at the moment. I mean, this will be the biggest gap for P1 to P2 ever, I would well imagine, and he's quite possibly going to finish with less than half the points of Max, which is so outrageous. And even as I said earlier, if you take Perez out of the equation, Max obviously still wins the Constructors on his own because they have more points. Max has more points than Mercedes do combined. But even if Perez literally didn't enter the races, Max would still be leading the Constructors, as in every Perez win or P2 would have shifted everybody else up. Max would still be winning. Like, that just shows the strength of the Red Bull, but also the strength of Max as a driver. And the fact that Perez isn't able to put anything together at the moment is, well, indicative that he's got to go at some point. When that is, that's a question. But it seems to me increasingly unlikely that they will actually keep him in the car next season, given all the noise around it, and the criticism is only mounting weekend after weekend. And McLaren are closer, it seems like a recipe for this to be the case. So very much interested your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care, and I'll see you next time.